Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and recently I decided, for some reason, that I wanted to try making chicken parmesan. Now, I say some reason because I don't really actually eat it that often, and I've definitely never tried to make it. So I started out by looking up a recipe, and somewhere in that process concluded that when you break chicken parmesan down to all of its basic components, you have a fried chicken breast topped with tomato sauce and cheese, usually served with a side of spaghetti or some kind of pasta, also topped with tomato sauce. So having broke it down to that kind of simple form, I decided that I could probably make chicken parmesan from scratch without a recipe. The first thing I did was attempt to make homemade mozzarella cheese. This is an ongoing project of mine. I've tried about 3 times. The first time was completely inedible. The second time did stretch, but was a little bland. Unfortunately, the third time was not the charm, and I ended up with a nice ricotta, but not mozzarella. So I ended up having to use shredded cheese for this project. Next, I went ahead and mixed up my pasta dough, and I did this the exact same way that I showed in a recent video on how to make homemade pasta from scratch, and I will link that video below. So I just mixed up the dough and set it in a bowl to rest for 30 minutes or so. While the dough was resting, I prepared my cookie sheet. I was going to bake the chicken breast because I did not want to try and mess with frying while also trying to film. And so I oiled a cookie sheet and then took my 2 chicken breasts and dipped them first in a bowl of heavy cream. And I used heavy cream because I just didn't want to use an entire egg just to dip 2 chicken breasts in. It always seems like a bit of a waste to me because you don't need that much of an egg, and yet you can't use it for anything because you put raw meat in it. So I don't like to do that too often if I can come up with an alternative. So I used heavy cream, and then after dipping it in that, I dipped the chicken breast into a mixture of panko breadcrumbs and Italian seasoning, and then placed them on my cookie sheet and baked them for, I believe it was 35 minutes at 350 degrees. This is the one part that I did look up because I didn't want to risk having uncooked meat. So I did look up what temperature and how long to bake it. So while the chicken was baking, I worked on rolling out the pasta dough and rewarming the sauce. So the tomato sauce is made from scratch, but I did not make it. We had some earlier and had some leftovers, and I just didn't see a point in me trying to make another very small batch of sauce because I didn't need a lot when I already had some that I could use instead. So I just pulled that out of the refrigerator and put it into a saucepan to warm while the chicken was baking and while I rolled out the pasta dough. After the chicken finished baking, I topped it with some sauce, followed by some shredded mozzarella cheese, unfortunately from the grocery store because mine had not turned out like I wanted it to, and popped it back in the oven to melt the cheese. And at the same time, I had brought my pasta water up to a boil so that I could put the noodles in about the same time that the chicken breast went into the oven. So basically the cheese melted while the pasta cooked because fresh noodles only need about 2 to 3 minutes in order for them to cook all the way through. So I basically cooked that while I melted the cheese. And once the pasta was cooked and drained and the chicken came out of the oven the second time, it was time to plate it up and serve it. all of that, how did it actually turn out? Well, in my opinion, the chicken was a bit dry. And I don't know if that has to do with the method of cooking because it was baked instead of fried, or maybe from having the sauce and the cheese on it and then putting it in the oven to melt the cheese, if that maybe caused the whole thing to like go from well cooked to dried out. But other than that, I thought it turned out really well, especially for something that was more or less an experiment, because this was completely new territory for me. Usually if I want to try a new dish, I find a recipe and I either follow it completely or I follow it fairly closely and adapt according to what I have in the kitchen or what I'm familiar with and comfortable with. So it was very interesting and kind of fun to take what seemed like a complicated dish and break it down to all of the individual components and realize, hey, I know how to do all of this, and be able to just do it without getting a dedicated recipe for it. And I hope this video has inspired you to get into the kitchen and try something new, whether it's a new recipe or a different method, or, you know, taking a dish and trying to figure out how to make it without following a recipe. Thanks for watching.